On the 25th of August, 1944, troops of General Leclerc's French 2nd Armored Division, their uniforms and equipment provided by the Americans, liberated Paris from a German occupation which had lasted for 4 years. Recently transferred to the 1st US Army, the French troops announced themselves as belonging to Lieutenant General George S. Patton's more famous 3rd US Army, which had led the breakout from Normandy. Later that day, General Charles de Gaulle, commanding the French Liberation Forces, arrived in Paris. As de Gaulle arrived, the last German troops were being driven out of the city. 4 days earlier, the remaining Germans in the Falaise pocket, completely surrounded by Canadian, Polish, British, and American troops, had either surrendered or been wiped out. The breakout from Normandy, which had begun with the British Epsom offensive on the 26th of June, was over and was a major Allied victory. If you wish to understand the wars of today, then you can learn much from the great battles of the past. For the Army, war studies is not just military history in the abstract. It's the study of past military events to give the present day a context, an important part of your training as an officer. And what you can see for yourself about a battle of the past is just as important as anything you might read or be told. If you can visit the battlefield, well, that's fine, particularly if, like Normandy, the countryside has not changed much through the years. But the only way for you to go back into the past, to see for yourself what the battle was like, is by films and photographs. For the student of war, they are the time spent on reconnaissance, which, as we all know, is seldom wasted. That is why this video has been made. Play it through as often as you like. Get to know it thoroughly. It can't show you everything about the breakout from Normandy. Every time you watch it, you will notice something new, and it will help make some of the features of the battle more clear in your mind. The video will also help you see what has changed about war since the battle was fought, and perhaps what has stayed the same. Normandy was chosen for the invasion, partly because of the shelving, sandy beaches, which made it easier for troops and supplies to get ashore. Once inland, its most famous feature is the bocage, the farmland divided by hedgerows and lanes into small box-like fields. It reminded some soldiers of Devon or Dorset. It reminded others of the trench system of the First World War. It hasn't changed much even today. This is the American view advancing towards Saint-Lô. This is the church at Saint-Neville, near Caen. And this is Martinville, not far from Saint-Lô. Further south, near Montpinçon, the bocage gives way to steeper ground, the so-called Suisse Normande. The American positions at Saint-Lô, from which Operation Cobra, the start of their breakout, was launched, are characteristic of this sort of terrain, in which a small hill can be a major tactical feature. Also characteristic of Normandy are its small villages and old farmhouses, many dating back to the Middle Ages and built for defense. This is Le Mesnil-Fromentel, near Caen. This belt of bocage country, about 25 kilometers deep, obviously favored the defender. It provided natural ambush sites. It made the deployment of armor difficult and attacks hard to control. Only the country to the east of Caen, across which Operation Goodwood and Operation Spring were launched, was open ground. This is the view from the British start line for Goodwood, looking towards Bouguerbus Ridge. The ground that the British crossed is much the same today as it was then, and this is Cagny, where, during Goodwood, a few German anti-tank guns delayed the advance of the Guards' armoured division. In the heat of summer, any moving vehicles also threw up dust, attracting hostile fire. But dust wasn't always the problem. Heavy rain grounded aircraft. And the Allied logistics build-up was threatened by the storms in the English Channel between the 19th and 22nd of June. From the first Allied landings, the Germans attempted to hold as much French territory as possible, rather than fighting the flexible defensive battle that the Allies had expected. Because the Germans chose to fight their battle close to the beaches, the Allies found stockpiling and moving the massive amounts of ordnance, fuel, and other supplies needed for the breakout was a serious problem. By the end of June, despite the delays during the Great Storm, the Allied lodgement area was already overcrowded. The lack of space for temporary landing fields, runways, and aircraft dispersal was particularly serious. By the end of August, 2 million men, 500,000 vehicles, and 3 million tons of stores and supplies had been landed over the beaches and through the Mulberry Harbour. In the narrow country lanes of Normandy, traffic control and good discipline was vital. All the Allied transport, all their artillery, and all their infantry had either wheeled or tracked vehicles, sometimes both. The American M3 half-track was used by the mechanized infantry of Allied armoured divisions for better cross-country performance. The Americans combined the tanks, self-propelled guns, and mechanized infantry of their armoured divisions into battle groups, which they called combat commands. Mistakenly, the British did not. Only one infantry battalion in a British armoured division had half-tracks and served with the division's armoured brigade. The infantry brigade, like all other British infantry, rode in lorries. The Germans, like the Americans, had half-tracks for their mechanized infantry, the Panzer Grenadiers, who also combined with tanks and guns to form battle groups. Their Panzer divisions, including those of the SS, were completely motorized. The infantry divisions, however, relied on horses and wagons for their transport, as many as 5,000 horses to a division. Some, the so-called static infantry divisions of overage or unfit troops, were not even that lucky. They had no transport and had to march. But it was not just transport problems which plagued the Germans. Often during the breakout, chances for success were thrown away because German troops and tanks were stranded without fuel or ammunition. In contrast, the Americans in the first week of Cobra used tanks, trucks, and half-tracks to push 100,000 fighting troops through a gap just 5 miles wide, held open by tactical air support. The German front disintegrated. Most of the Allied troops in Normandy felt that man for man, the German fighting soldiers, particularly in the SS, were more aggressive, showed more initiative, and were better at minor tactics. To overcome this, to achieve more effective firepower and greater mobility than the Germans, the Allies used their industrial might to the fullest possible extent. Tactical air power was crucial for the Allies. Between the first landings on the 6th of June and the end of August, almost 500,000 sorties were flown by Allied air forces over Normandy. Of these, more than half were flown by the British 2nd Tactical Air Force and the US 9th Air Force, which, between them, averaged more than 3,000 sorties a day in direct support of Allied ground troops. In response, the 3rd Air Fleet of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, could average only 300 sorties a day at most. Often days went by without German troops even seeing a friendly aircraft. This was not only bad for German morale, but for German mobility. Air attacks made it almost impossible for them to move their tanks and vehicles any distance by day and played havoc with their supply lines. Most feared by the Germans was the British Typhoon, which had 8 unguided 60-pound rockets for ground attack. Allied forward air controllers with the fighting units had such aircraft on call in cab ranks on every day of the campaign, except when bad weather grounded them. For major offensives like Charnwood, Goodwood or Cobra, the full weight of an Allied air assault included heavy 4-engine bombers such as the RAF's Lancaster and Halifax and the American Liberator, normally employed in a strategic bombing role. More than 1,500 such heavy bombers were used at the start of Goodwood. American medium bombers were employed to attack lesser targets and where heavy cratering had to be avoided. A free-fall bomb, unlike an artillery shell, needs only a thin metal casing, and most of its weight is explosive. Used as flying artillery, the effect of such bombing raids was devastating. Air power and artillery were the most feared and effective of the Allied weapons in Normandy. Traditionally, the artillery regarded itself as the most professional arm of the British Army. Its strength came, above all, from an efficient radio net and a control system which allowed quite junior officers and NCOs to call, in an emergency, on the firepower of up to a regiment of guns. In the maze of the bocage, good map reading to direct the fire of the guns was a vital skill. One of the most powerful German units in Normandy was also artillery, although in typical German fashion, it actually belonged to the Luftwaffe. It was the 3rd Flak Corps, most of which was deployed opposite the British front. Used for both anti-aircraft and anti-tank defence, 3rd Flak Corps had at least 120 of the heavy, dual-purpose 88mm flak guns and twice that number of lighter pieces. In Normandy, these guns were far more of a success against tanks than against aircraft. At ranges of less than 100 meters, both sides used small, man-portable, shaped charged rocket projectiles capable of penetrating 200 millimeters of armor. Introduced during the war, these made a major difference to tank mobility in close country. A favorite of the Germans was the Panzerfaust, seen here being demonstrated by the British. Some German divisions had a complete anti-tank infantry company equipped with nothing but these weapons. The Germans also had the Panzerschreck, a weapon comparable to the American bazooka. The British used a spring-loaded weapon called a Piat, which stood for Projector Infantry Anti-Tank. For close infantry support in the Breakout, and to help stop the Mortain counter-attack, the Americans used tracked, turreted vehicles, which were technically not tanks, but tank destroyers, such as the M10 Wolverine and the M18 Hellcat. The Germans favoured a range of self-propelled anti-tank guns, which they called assault guns. The British had the Churchill tank, heavily armoured and very hard to disable, but with a top speed of only 15 miles an hour. One regiment was equipped with the Mark 8 Churchill Crocodile, a flamethrower for burning out strong points. To clear minefields, the British and Americans used one of the first examples of a flail tank, which simply exploded the mines in its path. Common main battle tanks of both sides were broadly comparable with each other. The American M4 Sherman, the British Cromwell, and the German Panzer Mark IV all weighed 25 to 30 tons and had frontal armour of 70 to 80 millimetres, far less than modern main battle tanks. Each one had a 75mm gun as its main armament and was incapable of firing accurately on the move. The American Sherman was by far the most common Allied tank of the war, equipping not only American troops, but those of all the Allies, including the British. By the end of the war, America had built 45,000 Shermans and over 88,000 tanks in all, compared to a total German tank production of fewer than 25,000. The main Allied problem in Normandy was the two heavier types of German tank. The Mark V Panther, encountered for the first time in Normandy, had 100mm of frontal armour and weighed 45 tons. The Mark VI Tiger had the same frontal armour, 80mm of side armour, and an 88mm main gun. These tanks could only be penetrated by Allied tank guns at point-blank range. Those British tank regiments that had Shermans, not Cromwells, equipped one tank in each troop of 4 with a 17-pounder anti-tank gun. The British called these tanks Fireflies. But even the Firefly was still no match for the Tiger, and especially not for the King Tiger of 68 tons. The psychological effect of the Panther and Tiger, as much as their physical impact, restricted Allied mobility during the Breakout. Allied reliance on artillery and air power rather than tanks and infantry, a reluctance to send a man where they could send a bomb or shell instead, became very marked as the campaign in Europe continued. Some have argued that, anxious to avoid casualties, the Allies actually suffered too many, lost because they failed to take the risks to bring the battle to a speedy conclusion. It's an easy thing to say. Each person who fights in battle finds it a unique and strange experience. Perhaps at one level, every battle can be reduced to a series of big arrows on a little map. But those who fought in the Breakout from Normandy remember it for other things, not only for the fear, the noise, the chaos common to all battles, but the memory is special to Normandy alone. For the heat, the dust, when moving at high speed down a country road. For the flies and the small green apples of the cider country. For the smell of rotting cows and horses in the fields. Each battle, each day was different for every one of the more than 3 million men and women of both sides who fought in the breakout from Normandy. It is well to remember also that battles are not fought in a vacuum. In order to win the battle and break out of Normandy, the Allies were forced to bomb the city of Caen and fight their way forward over the homes of their French allies. No one knows how many were killed. But if asked, the majority would probably have agreed with the citizens of Paris that to free their country, this was a necessary thing. It was, after all, the reason why the Allies were fighting together and why they had come.